Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Healthy Housing Day. I am Jennifer Moon with Unity Care Northwest, and we're really pleased that everyone was able to come out today and join us for what we hope is going to be a very good discussion about the intersections between health, housing, and the built environment. Our keynote speaker is going to come up in just a few minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion later this afternoon. I'd like to start out by thanking our Housing Week partners, Sustainable Connections, Opportunity Council, and Colshan Community Land Trust, as well as our sponsors for Housing Week, Whatcom County Health Department, City of Bellingham, Chuckanut Health Foundation, United Way, Whatcom Community Foundation, Puget Sound Energy, and particularly Community Health Plan of Washington, who is sponsoring this discussion this afternoon. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about CHPW a little later. Thank you also to Mercy Housing Northwest for hosting us in this fabulous new facility that was built thanks to the Bellingham Home Fund. And we're looking forward to a really good discussion, so thank you again. In the weeks leading up to today, we've been asked more than once why a healthcare organization is involved in organizing a housing event. And we're hoping that by the end of today, that the answer to that question will become clear. But I'll start out by saying that the mission of community health centers like Unity Care Northwest is to break down barriers to care. And that includes homelessness, housing instability, transportation, food insecurity, and social isolation. Unity Care Northwest is one of 2 community health centers in Whatcom County, along with CMAR, and together we serve about 1 in 8 Whatcom County residents, providing primary medical, dental, pharmacy, and behavioral health services, regardless of the ability to pay. We're part of a national network of more than 1,300 community health centers nationwide that got their start in the war on poverty in the 1960s with the mission of improving access to healthcare for underserved populations. And today, community health centers across the country serve over 23 million people. We work to improve health outcomes for the patients we serve while working to bend the cost curve of healthcare, and so providing better quality care at lower cost. And so we're really pleased that we're able to be part of this discussion today about the intersections between health, housing, and our community's social immune system. And with that, I would like to introduce our Bellingham City Council President, Michael Lillquist, who's going to say a few words and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for everyone for coming here. I love old homes. I love historic neighborhoods, older cities. I was born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest, but I lived down south for a while. I love big front porches. I love county courthouses and the county square. And why? I think because they're all human scale forms of development. That they were built at a time when walking was a universal way to get around and people were just simply closer to each other. So my name is Michael Lillquist. I'm now on the Bellingham City Council, and as part of kind of educating myself as a city council member, I started looking into this more formally, into smart growth and what it meant to build in an environmentally sustainable manner. And I looked into what it also meant to develop in a financially responsible manner, sort of a strong towns analysis, if you're familiar with this. And there are certain forms of development, mixed-use development, dense development. My gosh, it was the exact same sort of housing styles and neighborhood styles that I liked. We used to build neighborhoods that now we see in retrospect are environmentally responsible and financially sustainable. I also looked into what it was to make a child-friendly, safe environment. And you know what? It was the exact same housing forms. Then I heard of the idea of an elder-friendly community. Oh, I should look into what an elder-friendly community is like. It was the exact same housing forms, the exact same rules, how we built a city and neighborhoods and districts to be good for older people who are moving away from cars necessarily, perhaps, or aren't working anymore. It's the exact same neighborhood we needed for children. Matter of fact, it's the exact same neighborhood we needed for adults in our working lives. I also served for a while on the Tourism Bureau, and I looked into what makes a really good community for visitors as well as for locals. Turns out visitors like the same things that locals like, which, by the way, is the exact same walkable, livable, living communities that I've been running across in so many other ways. But what are good kind of neighborhoods that attract economic investment? So those are some of the exact same thriving, dense, mid-density, as I call them, neighborhoods and mid-rise urban centers. The exact same thing. Several years ago, I also ran across the idea of what are the health impacts of cities and what are unhealthy neighborhoods like. No surprise, it turns out that healthy communities are often the same sort of communities that are child-friendly, elder-friendly, economically sustainable, and financially affordable. And so that brings us to Dr. Suzanne Crowhurst Lennard. She is the co-founder and director of International Making Cities Livable conferences and co-founder and director of Child-Friendly Communities Alliance. She holds a doctoral degree in architecture from Berkeley and has studied and lectured both in the U.S. and Europe. Dr. Lennard's work addresses the social, cultural, and psychological aspects of architecture, urban planning, and city making. She has helped to clarify how the built environment affects social interaction, health, and the quality of everyday life. Her studies have focused on many topics, among which are attention to the way the built environment affects the lives of children and youth, the relationship between physical health, social health, housing, and the built environment, walkability, bikeability, and transit, mixed-use urban fabric and livability, the public square as the community's heart, and how communities can strengthen their social immune systems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lennard.
Well, thank you for that very gracious, lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to that reputation. I am thrilled to be here. I am just thrilled by this organization that you have put together 4 organizations in different fields, housing and public health and planning and so on, to really work on common issues to make your city more healthy and more livable. So this is what I have been dedicated to really my whole life, to try to have an interdisciplinary vision of what it takes to make a livable, healthy city. So I want to share with you some of our thoughts and work that's gone on in my organization. Our mission, International Making Cities Livable, is to enhance the well-being of all inhabitants, to strengthen community, to improve social and physical health, and to increase civic engagement by restructuring or reshaping the built environment. It's been known in the field of public health for a while now that if you really want to make improvements in public health, you have to look upstream. You can't just treat people as they get ill. You have to really make the environment, the context in which people are living, healthy. That's the only way you can have a long-term solution to making healthy cities, making healthy environments. So it seems obvious, right? But what is stopping us? We have such unhealthy environments in so many of our cities. I don't know Bellingham that well, but I'm sure there are a few things that could be improved in Bellingham too, even though you're doing some wonderful things I have seen. But there are major forces that are preventing us from achieving the best we could achieve. And the first is, well, there are 2 city-making value systems. And the first one is the GDP. Everything is measured financially, economically. The GDP, the primary goal is to use the city as an economic engine, right, to increase wealth. The other value system is based on quality of life. That is to take care for people and for the earth. And this is the value system that my organization stands for. The GDP goal is to maximize economic growth, and the primary way of doing that, the most powerful way, is through construction. And that is why, after the Second World War, for instance, there was this enormous pressure to build suburbs, to build housing out outside the city limits. That sells roads, sells cars, sells everything that every individual family needs. It was a huge boost to the economy, but they didn't foresee, perhaps, all the social and health costs that would come from that. Now, the suburbs have, we realize that there are some problems with the suburbs, and the developers and the architects have discovered a much faster way of making much more profits, much greater economic development through what we call vertical sprawl. Beware in Bellingham of vertical sprawl. You've not yet been hit by it, I see. But Portland is getting hit. That's where I live, and Portland is really getting hit by it now. So what we have is an unbalanced development system where all of the investment is going into private property, and there's not enough investment going into the public realm. So the money is getting put into buildings and not into the public realm, which belongs to all of us: streets, squares, parks, and so on. Profit is privatized and loss is socialized. And as a result of that, we have a pretty poor public realm in many parts of our country, in many around the world even. Roads are very often unsuitable for human beings. You can't walk on many streets, you can't bike on many streets. If you're old or you're a child, you've had it. I mean, you've got to be taken everywhere, right? And it's therefore not healthy because you can't get the exercise you need in getting to and from places. And this is one of the primary reasons we have this terrible epidemic of obesity in this country and other countries around the world. Globally, 1/3 of the population is either obese or overweight. And in the US, obesity accounts for 1 in 5 deaths. And for children, I think it's especially hard because children are now suffering as a result of obesity. They're suffering chronic diseases which in the past only affected elders, older people. Chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, liver diseases. All of those diseases are associated with obesity, and that is an absolute tragedy. So vertical and horizontal sprawl both tend to be associated with more social isolation. And the people who suffer most from this are elders, especially those who are now living alone, because they perhaps are not going to work anymore. They are less mobile. They can't get out of their house so easily. And then also children, small children, who have to stay in the house in order to be safe because the roads are not safe enough for them to explore and run around on their own. And also the parents, the stay-at-home parents of young children, who are also restricted in the amount of social interaction that may be available to them because they have to look after small children. As a result of a lack of social interaction, the more social isolation there is, the more children may become depressed, or they don't have enough experience in interacting in public, in a social environment, so they may lack social skills. They may therefore become shy. And of course, all of these things can now be treated medically. This is fine for the pharmaceutical industry, so it's great for the GDP, not so great for the children. And also bullying, violence. This is also largely to do with lack of social skills, lack of the ability to learn how to interact with kids who are different from them, and negotiate, get to know somebody and treat them as another human being, even though they're very different. But again, it can be treated medically, or the kids can be put into the army, or they end up in jail. That's great for the GDP too. I'm a cynic, perhaps. So depression among elders who, are leading more isolated lives is, again, it's a major health problem. But that also is often treated medically instead of looking upstream and seeing how can we avoid that happening in general. So my organization, International Making Cities Livable, has developed what we call principles of true urbanism to improve health and well-being. And there are many factors, but they break down into these 4 categories. First of all, we must facilitate access to community social life, social networks, neighborhood involvement, etc. We must facilitate access to nature, because nature is very healing in many, many ways. We must facilitate independent mobility, because that ensures exercise, walking, and being out in the public realm and meeting people. And we must maintain a human-scale, mixed-use, built environment, because that's really what makes possible these first 3. And also, the built environment carries messages which speak to us, which say, this is who you are. And these are the values that we as a community hold dearly. So I'll run through each of these 4 fairly quickly. The public realm is enormously important, but there are several huge differences between those 2 public spaces. The one on the left is a typical shopping mall. Lots of people there, people moving through, not much variation in age groups. There's one little boy in a stroller you can see, and there are some teenage girls who are talking to each other animatedly in the front on the left, probably saying, well, which shops are we going to go to next? But there's not a lot of conversation there, and most of the people are young adults. So there's really not a lot of social interaction or getting to know each other and so on. But look on the right-hand side. There's that little boy, and his big sister is on a bicycle. And to the left of them, there's a group with some children who are talking to adults. And then behind them, there's some teenage girls. And then there are some university students walking around. And then there are all kinds of adults, young adults, old adults, parents, grandparents, people who are working, people who are retired, and people from different socioeconomic groups. If you look at that little group of 3 men just to the left of the little boy, there's a guy who's wearing blue overalls. He's a plumber. The guy with his back to you is a lawyer, and the other guy works in the bank. And so they are all friends. They know each other. Because of that public realm, they interact and they talk and they share maybe different values. Maybe they're politically different, but they are able to talk and discuss things together. That's the kind of public realm we really lack in this country, and that we really need to try to create. Places where diverse people, everybody in the community is welcome to come together, meet, talk. There's a very, very important concept, the social immune system. And this was developed by researchers in public health and social scientists who discovered that if you have a strong social network, if you know a lot of people on a face-to-face basis, you meet people every day, you talk with people as you're just going about your everyday life, then you don't get sick so often. If you get sick, it's not so serious, and you live to a riper old age. So it's a really, really important concept, the social immune system. So the question is, how do you develop social networks in the community to give everybody a stronger social immune system so that people can help each other and talk to each other and keep each other healthy? In Europe, many of the European countries have realized this for some time, and they have developed policies because, of course, healthcare is paid for by the government, and so it is in their interest to save money by ensuring that people live in a healthy environment and that people are tied into communities and have strong social networks. So it's a strong movement in Europe. One of the strongest ways of developing social networks is to have neighborhood plazas. And if you have traveled in Europe, you've probably traveled to cities where there are plenty of neighborhood plazas. And Martin Buber, he was an ethicist, about 60, 70 years ago, I guess, said, architects must be set the task of building for human contact, building surroundings that invite meetings, and centers that shape meeting. So he knew already all of that time ago that this is really important. But these kinds of places where you pass through on your way to work or to school, where you go shopping, where you go and sit out at a cafe or on a bench, where you meet in the evening for a drink, or you go and have a cup of coffee, or just centers in the community where all of this takes place and where people's paths cross, are immensely valuable in maintaining a strong social network and a strong immune system. Depression, as I said, needs preventive interventions, and such as the possibility for older people to be able to walk to the farmer's market, because at the farmer's market you meet people, you have conversations, you maybe meet somebody from out of the country, and it seems like a very strange man, but he may be interesting. Or you go and you can play chess with friends in the park. Children mirror behavior. How do they learn to become social? How do they learn to become a full human being? We have mirror neurons. You've seen a baby and a mother looking at each other, smiling at each other. The baby smiles in response, laughs in response. It's because the baby is able to intuitively feel the love of the mother and responds by smiling and laughing. This is the basis for interaction, the non-verbal interaction that takes place. Even pre-verbal is the most important level at which we learn to understand other people. Peter Benson said, we must embed our children in webs of sustained relationships. Children can, interact with a total stranger if they feel safe in their mother's arms, and they can interact through hearing the tone of voice, through the facial expression, through touch, probably smell, all non-verbal cues which tell the child what kind of a person that is. And it's really important to have that fundamental level of understanding other human beings, even before we learn to put words to our feelings. And of course, children need a whole network of adults in the community. They need more than just their parents and their teachers, but people who have different ideas, different experiences, who can bring to the child some additional values and ideas of ways of being and dealing with issues in their life. This was a square that my husband and I studied for many years. And you looked around in the afternoon and there were all of these adults talking to each other as they came home from work, picked up something for supper, met somebody they knew. And you looked a little bit more carefully and you saw even the littlest children were doing exactly the same thing. They had learned this same pattern of social interaction, which I thought was very impressive. Sociability is another wonderful concept. It's the joyful, more playful form of interaction. It's an artistic form of interaction. It's not instrumental. It's not the kind of getting information, giving information, like I'm doing right now. It's much more valuable from a social point of view for the whole community. It's cordial. it treats everybody as an equal, and the whole purpose of interacting sociably is to give other people pleasure, so that everybody in that little circle is feeling good. You don't take anybody down, you don't make yourself more important, you make jokes that everybody can share, and maybe a little teasing, but everything is on a positive level, and it's very valuable for community, for development of community, and it really flourishes in good public spaces. So what are the characteristics of a good public space? Well, first of all, they need to be traffic-free. They need to be traffic-free because kids need to be able to run around, and you need to be able to hear what somebody is saying, so you don't want the sound of traffic. They need to be a place that brings together many different activities, as many shops and cafes and market stalls and people living there as possible. So little shops, especially small shops, because there's a much more personal interaction going on there than in a supermarket. Cafes and restaurants, because that allows people to sit out and spend time in the public realm, especially at night. That makes it very safe at night. There need to be people living around that space, because that's the eyes on the plaza, or as Jane Jacobs said, eyes on the street. You probably all know about Jane Jacobs. If you look at on the left-hand side, you can see at the third floor window, there's a couple leaning out of the balcony, looking down, and they're calling to the kids who are playing at the fountain, saying, "Come home, supper's ready." And it needs to have human-scale proportions. And so the buildings should not be so high that you can't see the sky above the buildings. This is a good sort of golden rule, that you can turn around and you can see a little bit of sky above all of the buildings. There need to be places to sit, formal places like benches with backrests, because that's for older people like me. I'm becoming older. But seating that allows interaction between people. So where you can have a little group sitting, talking together, or you can play chess or have a meal around a table, or even just benches that you can see the face of somebody sitting on the other side of that arc. And maybe you're watching something that's going on in the square, and you're both smiling at it and you catch each other's eye. And that's the first step in developing a connection between strangers. Informal seating, because kids especially love to sit on steps and ledges, and some kind of water or public art, especially that is meaningful for kids, that they understand what it is, that it tells a story about your neighborhood or your city, that they can climb on and play in. And of course, attractions such as entertainers and musicians are always good to bring people together. And there are special ways of starting these kinds of taking back the streets and creating public spaces for the community. Bristol, England, the mayor, George Ferguson, that's him in the red pants. He's an architect, by the way. We went to the same architecture school. He instigated Make Sundays Special. Every 2 weeks, I think it was, he closed the streets to traffic and opened them up for people, and had all kinds of, food and entertainers and events and all kinds of things, which really brought out people to enjoy that public space and be together and interact and get to know each other. And there are small ways in which small neighborhoods can do something similar. This is an effort that has started, I think, about 30 years ago in Portland, Share It Square. And it started with one neighborhood deciding that the traffic was going too fast across their intersection. They wanted to take that back from the cars. And so they got together and they designed this wonderful mural on the road, painted it together, everybody, children and everybody, and they do the painting every few years. Whenever it fades, they do it again. And it's now in about 30 different neighborhoods just in Portland and in other cities. And around it, in different areas, they have built things like, benches, because that's now a place where you want to sit, a tea and coffee table, neighborhood libraries, and so on. All done by the neighborhood, all created by the neighborhood. Farmers markets are another immensely important way for people to be able to come together, to talk as a social event. I live downtown in Portland, and I always go to the farmers market downtown, and I always see people I know, even from different parts of Portland. So it's a very good place for interaction. And in a public realm, you can also have more civic engagement. There are some cities who organize local self-help groups for different illnesses, different chronic illnesses. On the street, they have booths and so on to share the information about how do you deal with diabetes, or how do you deal with this, and so on, or petitions or whatever. It's a really good way of developing democratic dialogue. And of course, it's important to be able to have a place that you can go in the evening that's safe. You can get an ice cream or whatever. Okay, contact with nature. There's been an enormous amount of research in the last few years showing how important it is to have green places and parks close to where you are living. You get more exercise. It's much healthier. You become more fit. What's important is that the green spaces are near to where you live, not so important that you just have a big park somewhere in the city, but you can't get to it. So there's a little green strip across that plan, very narrow, but it really is accessible to lots of people. That the residential is the red on that plan. And that has a lot of impact on the health of the community because people use it, much more than the large green park at the top left of their plan. We've known for centuries how important nature is for health. In fact, in Europe, there are hundreds of spa towns where if you're a European, especially if you're German, they're very generous, you can get a 2-week stay in a spa town paid for by your health insurance. And one of the major prescriptions is to walk in the park every day. And there's always a beautiful park and beautiful architecture, and you drink the water. And there are a few other things that go along with it, but it's a good system. I like that. But now hospitals in this country have realized that it really helps healing, and so many hospitals have little gardens and parks associated with them. There's a lot of literature on this now. Nature's very important for emotional health, improves well-being and social interaction, reduces violence and stress. And trees protect cardiovascular and respiratory health. And there's even analysis of different trees have different qualities. A lot of research has been done. There's a lot of health inequality. Poor neighborhoods have far fewer trees than wealthy neighborhoods. So if you're looking for an action to take, look for the poor neighborhoods and plant trees in the poor neighborhoods. Community gardens also a way of having direct access to nature, especially valuable for children, and especially important in food deserts where you can only get, hamburgers or fast food, no proper vegetables and fruit. But it's also important as a way of building community. When people work together in a garden, that really builds strong social networks. Many cities have routes through their city which are in nature, and I have already discovered one in Bellingham. I'm staying in Fairhaven, and there is a wonderful path. I noticed a trail along the water there. But what a wonderful way to commute, much better than getting in your car and being encapsulated in metal and not having any interaction with humans or nature. Incidental nature, we can all improve how much nature there is just on the streets. Plants growing up the walls of the buildings, even across the streets, on balconies, on roofs. Incidental nature is very valuable. And we must always remember that cities in harmony with nature are very good for our endorphins. This is a strong reason to our endorphins create a sense of well-being. And architecture, there's a term called biophilic design, which you may have come across. This is architectural design which has some of the same characteristics as nature, that it's complex and that there is more and more detail as you look into it and as you come closer to it. And it's called fractals. But if you think about modern architecture, which is all steel and glass, there are no fractals. So there are lots of fractals in Victorian buildings, right? Okay. And then independent mobility. Years ago in Europe, they developed the concept of balanced transportation planning, and they said, okay, we've been designing our cities and our streets solely for cars up until now. We have to balance this. We have to now, in order to balance it, we have to primarily focus on pedestrians, next on bicycles, next on public transit. And then we will get a balanced system. And we must think about the trips that people make, not about the movement of cars. And the trips that children and elders make are as important as the trips that commuters make. At the time, it was very radical thinking, but now I think it's not quite so radical, but it's really, really important. The goal would be to develop pedestrian networks as much as possible, especially in the center of the city. But you need an urban fabric that is alive and where people are living in order for it to work. But for instance, that little map shows you the center of Freiburg, Germany, which is a little bit larger than Bellingham. I think it's 120,000. You're, what, 80,000? And the whole of the center of the city is traffic-free. So it's something to aim for. Now, this is interesting. This is from research that's been done in England. And they have realized that there has been an obsession with ghettoized play, so creating playgrounds, safe playgrounds, especially put fences around them so that nobody can get in, and the children can't run out into the streets and get run over. But children get bored with this, they have been finding. And they much prefer, if they have the opportunity, to play close to their home, to run around on the streets if they're safe, or in the driveways, or in little open areas near where they live. And the research shows that the amount of time that children spend on the playground, that's white, the left-hand diagram, is much, much less than the amount of time they spend playing close to home on the streets. And the amount of physical exercise they get on the playground is much, much less than the amount of physical exercise they get playing on the streets. And the amount of social interaction that they have is far less on the playground than on the streets. And so they are really developing priority to encourage play outside in the streets near where children live, to make them more accessible and safe, and because this is good for their health, for their social interaction. And so there are various ways of doing that. I mean, this is a very simple way of doing it, to create a play street. So when children come home from school, you close the street at each end, and you don't let cars come in unless they're coming in slowly just to park and they live there, but you don't allow through traffic. And kids can come out and play on the street for maybe 2 or 3 hours. So that's one simple way. Then there's another way, which is a more permanent way, and this is in hundreds of cities throughout Europe, what is called in Germany the Wohnstraße or the Woonwerf in the Netherlands. It's a living street, and there are special rules there. You can drive there, but only at walking speed. You can park there if you live there or if you're delivering there, but otherwise it's open to children to play, for everybody to use as the public space near their home. We need, of course, wide sidewalks and slowed traffic to make it safe for kids to be able to walk to school. And ways of slowing traffic and making the streets more safe is the parklets idea. Maybe you have some here in Bellingham, yes? Taking over a parking area on the side, beside the sidewalk, and turning it into a people place, either temporary or permanent. Complete streets is another good tool to use, and you may have some of those in Bellingham, where you widen sidewalks, you create good bicycle paths that are separate from the sidewalk and from the cars, and you reduce the speed of the traffic. The arterial roads are a real problem in so many of our cities, and they really need good attention because they are very dangerous. And the street at the bottom left, it's in San Diego. The arterial road was very dangerous, and they transformed it into what you see at the top right, with widened sidewalks, medians, roundabouts, trees. It slowed the traffic, and it made it much, much safer to cross and to be a pedestrian. Cycling is really important, and I understand you're strong on cycling in Bellingham, but it's not only healthy, it's good for social interaction, because unlike a car, you can slow down and you can stop and you can talk to people. And we all need to make our cities much safer for kids and for elders. I moved to Portland about 12 years ago, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to be able to buy a bicycle, and it has such a wonderful reputation as a biking city. I'm going to bike everywhere. And then I looked at the biking network, and I was so disappointed that I decided not to get a bike. It really needs to be much, much safer than most of our cities are doing. And we need to do things like keep the bicycles and the pedestrians separate, because bikes can hurt pedestrians. We need to, if bikes and traffic are in the same area, we need to bring bicycles to the front at an intersection so that they get a chance to move forward before cars do. That makes it much safer. But really what we need to do is buffered bike lanes so that pedestrians are safer, protected by the curb from the bicycles, and the bicycles are safer because they're protected by an area, a strip, as well as a curb, a physical barrier from the traffic. And it's no good to have, parked cars right next to bike lanes, because you park a car and you open your door and you sideswipe a bike. That's not good. And of course, public transit, to develop that as much as possible, is really important, because that's also healthy. You have to walk before and after. And the final point is maintaining a human-scale mixed-use built environment. The built environment creates walls to the public realm. shapes the public realm. And we need places that will bring people together with walls that create a kind of room. Even if it's a street, it creates a place, not just a space. We need an urban fabric which is continuous, buildings that are connected and that are mixed use. We need wide sidewalks, of course, because that's where we all pedestrians meet and mix and talk. We need the mixed use because we need the eyes on the street from people living above and the shops to draw people to that space so that there's a reason to go there. And then the public realm can become safer and more lively. We need active street-level facades, and that's not only in commercial areas, but also in some residential areas, as much as possible, like the porches that you were talking about. Or this is, bottom left is a street in Portland. It's an old building. Actually, it was something to do with the rail yards. And there's a platform there which has been turned into terraces, and the residents sit there in the evening and drink a glass of wine and chat with the people who are going by in the street. So that makes it very social. We need human scale buildings. Yes, absolutely. And we need a mix of income groups living together. This is so important. You know, traditionally, all of our cities were based on the shop house. It was a shop or a workshop at street level. Then the merchant who owned that business lived above with his family. And then the people who were working for him lived also above the family. So there was a whole socially integrated mix of incomes living in one building. We don't have that social structure anymore, but we can still mix people of different income groups together. The building on the right was actually the building that I first lived in when I went to Portland. It has shops and restaurants at street level. It has small studios, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments, and then luxury apartments on the top with grand views and so on. So it's still possible to do it. We just do it differently. With a good urban fabric, we can have inner courtyards, which can become semi-private, semi-public areas, which are safe for children to play, or good places for cafes and restaurants. But we really need inclusive squares, inclusive places where everybody can come together. That's one of the squares in a part of Barcelona in Spain. They have 10 squares in their small neighborhood. 10. And they're all very lively. But especially in poor neighborhoods, they really need places where people can come together and interact and networks can form. And we need beauty, of course, which is done in different ways in different cities, but needs to be beautiful. And we need to integrate nature into the built environment and maintain the identity of the city. I've seen some very nice new buildings in the Fairhaven area that I was walking around, which really seemed to carry the character of the older buildings there. I was impressed. We need to strengthen the social immune system by having a good public realm. Thank you very much. We have time, plenty of time for questions. Questions first?
With technology, and the young, young adults today utilizing, how do you see that and the impact that that's having on, these goals?
I see it rather negatively, as you can imagine. I'm very concerned that, for instance, if kids are told to go home and not play on the streets, then they go onto their iPhones or their pads or whatever, and they interact only through a medium. And that's not satisfying. It's not emotionally satisfying. Even though they're texting and that's communicating, it's just emotionally not the same thing as being face-to-face with somebody, really interacting and really sharing emotions. And I think for them, for kids especially, we need to have places where they can be safely together in the public realm and interact with not only their friends, but with adults around and, with other people in the community. I think eventually that's much more satisfying than being on the screen. So many kids have been committing suicide because of the messages they get through their texting or from their so-called friends and so on. Whereas I don't think that would happen if there were more face-to-face interaction. So I'm concerned about it.
Mine's a little bit more of a comment than a question. You've
Yes.
mentioned Fairhaven a couple times. I just thought I might mention there's a very active neighborhood group in Fairhaven that worked hard to make sure that apartment buildings could not be above, that we could always see the sky there. Trail building activities where you get access and people have to be approached and said, can you give us public access for a trail? So that's just one more aspect of making these kind of dreams come true. Thanks.
Fantastic. Do you live in Fairhaven?
Yes.
Yes. Good for you. Good for you. I wanted to ask, is everybody here involved in their neighborhood association, or are there neighborhood associations in every neighborhood? There are lots of nodding. Yes, good, because that's such an important way of helping the city to decide, what priorities to place on improvements in the neighborhoods. Okay, yes, you wanted to ask.
I just had a question specifically related to homelessness and the opioid crisis that we have going on right now, and how it affects some of these social squares and whatnot. Because I sense from patients that I've worked with in the past or the community, not wanting to go out, not wanting to take their families out in the great places we have here in Bellingham, simply because they don't feel safe or they're worried about what they may find there. And so how do you see that impacting some of your work and your research?
Good question. It's one that Holly White, do you remember William H. White, years ago, wrote a book called City. He was based in New York. He was developing pocket parks in New York. Yeah, the issue of how do we deal with homelessness and the, quote, undesirables in our society? Really, the only humane way of dealing with this is to make our public places so attractive and so lively that we go there because we see friends there. And there may be one or two homeless people as well, but you don't notice them because there are so many other people who are using that space who are more like us, and therefore we feel more comfortable there. I think we cannot, keep the homeless or people who have problems out of public places. That's not ethical. We can't design benches in such a way that nobody can lie on them and not even sometimes comfortably sit on them. I mean, San Francisco Union Square, they redesigned it and they put in benches that I'm a little bit overweight, but I had difficulty sitting in them because they were just too small, simply to discourage homeless people sleeping there. It hurts everybody if you design a public place that deters homeless people and, quote, undesirables. So I think we just have to take the other tack entirely and make our public spaces really attract people, really successful, a place that everybody wants to be, and where we can tolerate, where we can accept people who have problems of one kind or another. I mean, it's not ethical for us to shun people. We have to accept that they are human beings as well, and even interact with them in the public realm. There's a guy in Portland. He walks around in a very large blue blanket, and he's very often barefooted, and he doesn't have a lot on underneath, but he has some clothes on underneath. But he is quite crazy, and he obviously is homeless, and sometimes he's black from head to toe. He's probably been sleeping down by the river or something, and he's a little bit out of it. And I would see him regularly. He was in an area where I was living, and I would just say hello to him as I went by. He was very gentle, but said hello. And then I saw him up ahead, and I noticed somebody like me coming from the other direction and stopping and talking with him and saying, "How are you, John? How are things going?" And getting him into a conversation. And I thought, my God, this is fantastic. And so I began also talking with him a little bit more, and saying, "Hey, John, I think it's time you went and got a bath or shower. You really need it." But he was so grateful, obviously, just in that little bit of interaction, to be acknowledged as a human being. Because most people sort of walk by as if they don't see him.
I grew up in Los Angeles, and to me, sort of normal is all the things you described at the beginning as not being the right way to do it. And as I traveled around and learned more, I came to love these kind of areas that you show here. But what people think about as history or normal is actually the post-war built environment. And when you propose to change it, they get up in arms and they see, for example, a mixed-use neighborhood, that's a ghetto. Or if you're trying to make the streets safer for bikes, that's a war against cars. I was wondering, what kind of messages do you find are more effective in terms of reaching people who maybe haven't thought about these things or visited these kind of places and seen how much better they can be?
Yeah. One thing is to say, well, you're just giving more options, making it possible for those people who want to bicycle or walk to be able to do so. Still allowing the cars can still go there, but you're encouraging a more healthy mode of transport. Ghettos, I mean, it's really a very outmoded concept now, I think, thinking of the city as the ghetto. You have to give them images of what a real urban, mixed-use, healthy environment looks like. And that's why I use a lot of images from European cities. This is how it can be. Really alive, really a wonderful place to be. Very successful, economically successful, as well as healthy and sociable and so on. So I think there probably is a lot more education needed for some people. But there will still be some people like, what was his name? Ford, the mayor of Toronto. Remember him? Oh, yes. It's a hard sell, but it's worth keeping on and talking about it and educating people.
So going to what you just mentioned in terms of using European cities as examples, Bellingham, I think, is a lot like many West Coast cities in that it has this tiny downtown core and suburban sprawl around it. Do you have examples of cases like ours that have successfully transformed into more of the model you're talking about? And how do you do that when, we have like the Birchwood neighborhood that is now a total food desert. There isn't even a grocery store there. There's just empty parking lots. And trying to create an urban village there when it's very low income and not necessarily a lot of infrastructure around it to help with that.
Well, there is a very interesting case. And this is, I showed one slide of it, but you might not have known where it was. Carmel, Indiana. Ever hear of Carmel, Indiana? Part of the suburban sprawl, you know it. North of Indianapolis. really part of the bedroom community for Indianapolis. About 20 plus years ago, a new mayor came in, Jim Brainerd, and he decided he wanted to create a real city center. That traffic was much too bad. The first thing I think he started on was building roundabouts in order to make the traffic safer, slow it, make it easier to build bike lanes and crossings and so on. He's now got over 100 roundabouts in this neighborhood. But the really ambitious vision he had was to build a center for this suburban sprawl. There was like one street which was from the late 18th, early 19th century, and he turned that into more of an arts center, retained the historic buildings that were still in existence. And then he began building a real city center just south of that little arts area. And using human scale architecture, mostly traditional character, classical kind of architecture. One of the first things he built was a concert hall, which is quite magnificent. It's called the Palladium, and it's designed after the Palladian architecture in Italy. And then he has since then built a lot of mixed use, about 5 stories high maximum, shops, people living above, offices above. It's growing and growing and growing. And it's enormously popular with the residents of the city. And it's growing very rapidly. So look into Carmel, Indiana, as a model for how to rethink the center of your city. You don't have to do it in classical style. It shouldn't be done in classical style. Perhaps it should be done in a local style. But really consolidating a center and making places where people come together and there's a more of a core and a residential population living there around and above businesses. It's quite inspirational. Finished with our questions. Thank you.